I still remember the exact moment when the doorman looked at me and said words I never expected to hear outside my own building. After 14 hours of travel and nearly 2,000 miles in the air, all I wanted was to walk through the lobby doors and finally get home. My business trip to Denver had stretched longer than expected because of meetings that ran late and a delayed flight out of Chicago earlier that week. By the time the taxi dropped me off in front of my apartment building on West Lake Street, the evening air was cool and quiet and the city lights reflected softly against the glass towers across the street. I grabbed my small carry-on suitcase from the trunk, thanked the driver, and stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the familiar sense of relief that always came with returning home after a long trip. The building looked exactly the same as it always did. The polished brass handles on the glass entrance doors reflected the warm lobby lights inside, and the large marble floor in the lobby could already be seen through the windows. I had walked through those doors hundreds of times over the last 6 years. It was a routine so normal that I barely thought about it anymore. My apartment was on the 12th floor, and usually when I returned from work trips my wife Emily would already be waiting upstairs. Sometimes she would be cooking dinner and sometimes she would simply greet me at the door with that quiet smile she had when she knew I was exhausted from traveling. Those small moments always made the long flights worth it. As I rolled my suitcase toward the entrance, I noticed Frank, the evening doorman, standing beside the front desk inside the lobby. Frank had worked in this building for years. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name and often asked about my travel schedule when I passed through. He saw me approaching through the glass doors and gave a quick nod of recognition. At least that was what I thought at first. But when I reached for the handle to pull the door open, something unexpected happened. Frank stepped forward quickly and placed his hand against the door before I could enter. At first I assumed he was greeting me or maybe opening the door for me the way he sometimes did when residents were carrying luggage. But instead of smiling, he looked strangely uncomfortable. His eyes moved from my suitcase to my face and then down toward the floor, as if he was trying to decide how to say something difficult. For a second, I just stood there on the sidewalk staring at him through the glass, wondering if I had misunderstood the situation. I tapped lightly on the door, thinking maybe he had not realized I was trying to come in. Frank slowly opened the door just enough for his voice to reach me, but he did not move aside to let me pass. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I need you to wait a moment before coming inside." The words were so unexpected that I thought I must have heard them wrong. "Wait outside my own building?" I asked with a tired laugh. Frank did not laugh back. Instead, he reached behind the desk and picked up a plain white envelope that had been resting near the front computer monitor. His movements were careful and deliberate, like someone following instructions that they did not fully agree with. The lobby behind him was empty and unusually quiet for that time of night. He stepped closer to the door and held the envelope toward me through the narrow opening. "The building manager asked me to give this to you as soon as you arrived," he said. Something in his voice made the exhaustion from my trip disappear instantly. I took the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of the paper inside and noticing that my name had been written across the front in neat handwriting. For a moment neither of us spoke. The city traffic hummed quietly somewhere down the block and a cold breeze moved between the buildings behind me. I looked back at Frank still standing in the doorway and asked the only question that made sense in that moment. "Why can I not just go upstairs?" Frank hesitated for a second and then shook his head. Slightly as if the answer was not his to explain. "You should read the letter first," he said quietly. I stood there on the sidewalk outside my own building holding the envelope while the cold evening air drifted through the street behind me. For a moment I did not move because the entire situation felt strangely unreal. I had just flown nearly 2,000 miles from Denver expecting nothing more complicated than unlocking my apartment door and collapsing onto my couch after a long week of meetings. Instead, I was standing outside the entrance like a visitor who did not belong there. Frank remained just inside the doorway with the glass door partly open. The warm light from the lobby stretched across the sidewalk and illuminated the envelope in my hand. My name was written clearly across the front in careful handwriting. Daniel Carter. There was no return address and no company logo. Just my name. I looked up at Frank again, hoping he might suddenly explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But he only gave a small uneasy nod toward the envelope as if reminding me that the answer was inside. So I slid my finger under the edge of the flap and opened it slowly. The paper inside was folded neatly in half. When I unfolded it, I immediately noticed the building letterhead printed at the top. It was official. Not a personal note. Not a mistake. My eyes moved down the page while the sounds of the city continued quietly around me. A car passed through the intersection down the block. Somewhere a train horn echoed faintly across the river. Yet everything seemed strangely distant compared to the words on that paper. The message was short and direct. It stated that my building access credentials had been temporarily deactivated by request of the current registered resident of apartment 12C. My first reaction was simple confusion. I read the line again more slowly just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. Temporarily deactivated. Requested by the registered resident. That sentence made no sense to me at all because there was only one registered resident in that apartment besides me. My wife Emily. I kept reading. The letter explained that until the matter was clarified with building management, my access card and key code would remain disabled for security reasons. If I had questions, I was instructed to contact the building manager during normal office hours. I lowered the paper and stared at the lobby floor through the glass door while my mind tried to catch up with what I had just read. Frank was still watching me carefully. His expression carried the same uncomfortable sympathy someone might show when they knew bad news had just arrived but could not do anything to change it. I looked back down at the paper one more time. There was a second line printed near the bottom that I had missed during the first reading. It listed the name of the person who had submitted the request earlier that week. Emily Carter. Seeing her name written there in black ink made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. Emily had asked the building to deactivate my access. The thought was so unexpected that for a moment my brain tried to reject it completely. Maybe she had reported my key card lost by mistake. Maybe there had been some kind of administrative mix-up. There had to be a simple explanation. Emily and I had spoken on the phone just 2 days earlier while I was still in Denver. Our conversation had been short because she said she was busy, but nothing about her voice suggested something like this. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back inside the envelope. Frank finally spoke again in a quiet voice. Daniel, the manager, said you might want to call upstairs before trying to come in. The way he said it told me that he already knew more than I did. I took my phone from my pocket and looked down at the screen where Emily's name appeared in my contacts list like it always had. For the first time since arriving home, I felt something deeper than confusion. A quiet sense that whatever was happening inside apartment 12C might be very different from the life I thought I was returning to. I stared at Emily's name on my phone screen for several long seconds before finally pressing the call button because part of me was still hoping there was a simple explanation waiting on the other end of that line. The phone rang once. Then twice. Each ring seemed louder in the quiet evening outside the building entrance. Frank had stepped back into the lobby to give me privacy, but I could still feel his eyes occasionally glancing toward the glass door. By the third ring, my heart was beating faster than it should have been after nothing more than a phone call. Finally the line connected and Emily's voice came through. Hello. Her tone sounded calm but distant, as if she had been expecting this call. Emily, it is me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though confusion was still twisting inside my chest. I just got back from Denver and the doorman stopped me outside the building. They handed me a letter saying my access has been disabled. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Not the kind of silence caused by a bad signal or background noise, but the kind that happens when someone is carefully deciding what to say next. Yes, Daniel, I know about that, Emily finally replied. Her words were quiet and controlled, which somehow made them feel heavier. You know about it, I repeated slowly while glancing down again at the envelope in my hand as if it might suddenly change its meaning. Emily took a slow breath before speaking again. I spoke with building management earlier this week, she said. I asked them to deactivate your key access temporarily. Hearing her confirm it directly felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I tried to process the sentence, but the question that immediately rose to the surface was impossible to ignore. Why would you do that, Emily? I asked. My voice was still calm, but inside my mind every possibility was racing through me at once. Another quiet pause followed, and this one felt even longer than the first. When Emily finally spoke again, her voice carried a firmness that I had rarely heard from her before. Daniel, I think it is better if we talk about this somewhere else, she said. Not in the hallway and not with the doorman standing nearby. Her words made me glance again toward the lobby where Frank was now pretending to organize a stack of delivery packages on the counter. I stepped a few feet farther down the sidewalk to create more distance from the door. Emily continued speaking in the same steady tone. I needed some time to think while you were away on your trip. Things between us have not felt right for a while, and I needed space to sort out my thoughts without everything becoming an argument the moment you walked through the door. Her explanation left me standing in silence for several seconds because although we had experienced normal disagreements like any married couple, nothing in our recent conversations had suggested something this serious. I searched my memory for signs I might have missed, but all I could picture were ordinary evenings in our apartment, cooking dinner together or watching television after work. Emily, I said carefully, I do not understand what you mean. If something has been bothering you, we could have talked about it before I left. You did not have to lock me out of my own home. The last words slipped out before I could soften them, and I immediately regretted the frustration in my voice. Emily responded more gently this time. I did not do it to hurt you, Daniel. I did it because I needed a little control over the situation while I figured out what I truly feel. Her words were calm, but they carried a quiet finality that made my stomach tighten again. After a moment, she added one more sentence that completely changed the direction of the conversation. I am not alone in the apartment right now, she said. That statement echoed in my mind as I stared up at the dark windows of our building. Not alone. The phrase opened 100 questions all at once, but I forced myself to ask the simplest one first. Who is there with you, Emily? On the other end of the line I heard her inhale slowly, as if preparing for a conversation that neither of us had planned to have tonight. I waited for Emily to answer while the city noise hummed quietly around me and the windows of our building reflected the glow of streetlights across the pavement. The question I had just asked felt simple, but the silence that followed made it feel much heavier than I expected. For several seconds, the only sound on the phone was the faint background noise from the apartment on her end of the line. Finally, Emily spoke again. Her voice was calm but careful, as if she were stepping across a thin sheet of ice. My sister Claire is here, she said. The tension that had been tightening in my chest loosened slightly, but not completely, because the situation still made very little sense. Your sister, I repeated slowly while trying to understand why that would require my access to be disabled. Emily continued before I could ask another question. She arrived 2 days ago. She needed a place to stay for a few days, and I thought it would help if I had someone to talk to while I sorted through everything that has been on my mind. I looked up at the building again and imagined Claire sitting somewhere inside the apartment that I had left only a week earlier. Claire and I had always been polite with each other, but we were not particularly close. Still, her presence did not explain why I was standing outside like a stranger. Emily, I said carefully, I understand that Claire is visiting, but that still does not explain why I cannot enter my own home. This time Emily did not pause as long before responding. Because I did not want our first conversation about this to happen in the middle of the living room with tension already high, she said. I wanted time to explain things calmly before you walked through the door expecting everything to be normal. The word normal echoed in my mind while I shifted my weight on the sidewalk. The air had grown colder and a light breeze moved down the street carrying the distant smell of rain. I tried to focus on keeping my voice steady even though confusion and frustration were beginning to mix together. Emily, I have been on a plane for nearly 4 hours, and now I am standing outside our building with a letter saying I cannot come inside. I think Normal already left the situation a while ago. I did not raise my voice, but the honesty in the sentence hung between us. Emily sighed softly on the other end of the call. I know, Daniel, she said quietly. That is why I wanted to talk to you before you came upstairs. I needed you to hear everything first without reacting immediately. I took a slow breath and leaned back slightly against the cool metal railing beside the entrance. People occasionally passed along the sidewalk, but none of them paid attention to the conversation that was quietly changing the direction of my evening. All right, I said after a moment. Then tell me what is going on. Emily hesitated once more before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a tone of vulnerability that I had not heard from her in a long time. During the last few months I started feeling like we were living beside each other instead of with each other, she explained. You have been traveling more for work, and when you are home you always seem distracted by emails or phone calls. I tried to ignore it at first because I know your job is demanding, but eventually it started making me feel invisible inside our own apartment. Her words landed more heavily than I expected because they were not angry accusations. They sounded more like quiet observations that had been building for a long time. I searched my memory for the evenings she was describing and slowly realized that some of them felt uncomfortably familiar. Emily continued, speaking gently but firmly. Claire noticed it when she visited last month, and she asked me if everything was all right between us. That question forced me to admit that something had been bothering me, even though I had not said it out loud before. Hearing that made me stare again at the windows above the lobby entrance. The life I thought I was returning to suddenly felt less certain than it had an hour earlier when my plane touched down at the airport. I remained leaning against the railing outside the building while Emily's words continued to settle slowly in my mind, and for the first time since the conversation started I allowed myself to think honestly about what she had just said. The street behind me had grown quieter as the evening moved deeper into night, and the glow from the lobby lights reflected softly across the sidewalk. For several seconds I did not speak because I was replaying small moments from the past few months that I had not paid much attention to before. Late nights when I answered emails during dinner. Weekend mornings when I promised to relax but still opened my laptop before finishing my coffee. None of those things had seemed important at the time because they felt like temporary demands from a busy job, but hearing Emily describe them now made them sound very different. I exhaled slowly before finally responding. Emily, I said quietly, I did not realize you felt that way. My intention was never to make you feel invisible. On the other end of the phone I heard a faint movement as if she had shifted position somewhere inside the apartment. I know that, Daniel, she replied gently. I never thought you were doing it to hurt me. That is why it became so confusing. You were always kind when we talked and you always said everything was fine between us, but at the same time you seemed further away every week. Her explanation did not sound angry. If anything, it sounded tired in a way that made the situation feel more serious than any argument would have. I rubbed my hand across my forehead while staring at the envelope still folded in my other hand. The paper had become slightly wrinkled from being held so tightly. Emily continued, speaking in the same calm tone. When Claire visited last month, she noticed that you answered 2 work calls during dinner and then spent almost an hour on your laptop afterward. After you went to bed, she asked me a simple question that I could not answer honestly. She asked if I felt like your partner or if I felt like someone waiting in the background of your schedule. Hearing that question repeated out loud made something shift quietly inside my thoughts because I remembered that exact evening clearly now. I had believed I was handling everything normally at the time, but from Emily's perspective the moment must have looked completely different. I took another slow breath and tried to choose my words carefully. Emily, I admit that my work has taken more of my attention recently than it should have, but locking me out of the apartment still feels like a drastic step. Why not just tell me directly that you were unhappy? The line remained quiet for a moment before she answered. I tried, Daniel, she said softly. Maybe not in a dramatic way, but I mentioned it several times. When I asked if you could take a weekend away from work, you said the next month might be easier. When I asked if we could plan a short trip together, you said we would talk about it after your next project finished. Each time the conversation ended politely, but nothing really changed. Her words made me lower my eyes toward the pavement because I could remember those conversations now that she mentioned them. At the time they had sounded like normal scheduling discussions, but listening to them through Emily's memory revealed how often I had postponed things that mattered to her. The realization did not feel comfortable. It felt like discovering a quiet crack in the foundation of something I had assumed was stable. After a moment, Emily spoke again. I asked the building to deactivate your access because I wanted us to have this conversation before we fell back into the same routine, she explained. If you walked through the door tonight, we would probably greet each other politely, eat dinner, and pretend nothing was wrong again. I needed to interrupt that pattern even if it meant creating an uncomfortable moment like this. I lifted my eyes toward the darkened windows above the lobby and tried to imagine what Emily and Claire were doing inside the apartment while I stood outside, thinking about every choice that had quietly shaped the last few months of our marriage. For the first time since the doorman handed me the envelope, I realized that the locked door might not have been meant as punishment. It might have been the only way Emily knew how to make sure I truly listened. I stood quietly outside the building for a long moment after Emily finished speaking because the meaning of her words had begun to settle deeper than the first wave of confusion I felt earlier. The cool evening air brushed across the sidewalk, and somewhere down the street a passing car splashed lightly through a shallow puddle left by an earlier rain. For the first time since the doorman handed me the envelope, I realized that the situation in front of me was not really about a locked door. It was about everything that had slowly built up behind that door during the months I had been too distracted to notice. I looked up again toward the rows of apartment windows rising above the lobby entrance and tried to picture the familiar living room that Emily and I had shared for the last 3 years. The couch near the window. The small wooden table where we drank coffee on Sunday mornings. Suddenly those memories felt less certain than they had earlier in the day when I boarded the plane in Denver. Emily's voice returned gently through the phone. "Daniel, are you still there?" "Yes," I answered quietly while straightening slightly from the railing. "I am here. I am just thinking about what you said." There was another brief silence, but this one felt different from the earlier pauses. It felt less like distance and more like two people carefully measuring their next steps. After a moment I spoke again. "Emily, I understand now why you felt the need to interrupt things. I wish I had recognized what was happening before it reached this point, but I cannot pretend that everything you described is wrong. I have been distracted by work more than I should have been." On the other end of the call, Emily released a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. "I was afraid you might only be angry about the way I handled it." I glanced at the envelope still resting in my hand and gave a small tired smile even though she could not see it. "I am not going to pretend I enjoyed being stopped at the door of my own building," I admitted. "But if the reason behind it is something this serious, then anger alone is not going to solve anything." The truth was that the frustration I felt earlier had already begun to shift into something more thoughtful. Being forced to stand outside for the last 20 minutes had given me more time to reflect on the past few months than I had allowed myself in a long time. Emily spoke again after a moment. "Claire is sitting in the kitchen right now trying very hard not to listen to our conversation," she said quietly. "She told me earlier that sometimes an uncomfortable pause can help people hear each other more clearly." I let out a small breath of amusement at that sentence because it sounded exactly like something Claire would say. "I have always respected your sister's honesty," I replied. "Even when it makes situations a little awkward." Emily chuckled softly for the first time since the conversation began, and that simple sound eased some of the tension that had been hanging between us. After a moment she continued, speaking in a more serious tone. "Daniel, the reason I wanted this conversation first is because I need to know whether we are willing to change the direction we have been heading. I do not want to spend the next several years feeling like I am waiting for small pieces of your attention between business trips." I leaned my shoulder lightly against the railing again and looked up toward the building entrance where the warm lobby lights glowed behind the glass door. Frank was still inside organizing packages, but now he seemed less concerned than before. I focused again on Emily's words and answered honestly. I cannot promise that my job will suddenly become quiet or simple, I said slowly. But I can promise that I am willing to look at how I have been balancing my priorities. Because standing out here tonight made me realize something very clear. If I continue the way I have been living, I might eventually lose far more than a few hours of work time. There was another pause on the line, but this one carried a quiet sense of possibility. After a moment, Emily spoke again in a calmer voice. Then maybe the next step is simple, she said. Instead of arguing about the past through a phone call outside the building, maybe we should sit down and talk face to face like two people who still care about what happens next. I looked toward the glass entrance again while Emily's words lingered in my mind, because what she had just suggested sounded simple on the surface, yet the moment still carried a strange tension that had not completely disappeared. For a few seconds I did not respond because I was thinking about the last time Emily and I had actually sat down and talked without distractions. The memory felt surprisingly distant. Eventually I took a slow breath and spoke into the phone again. I agree with you, Emily, I said quietly. Talking face to face is better than standing out here on the sidewalk trying to understand everything through a phone call. The only problem is that right now I still cannot get through the door. My words were not meant to sound sarcastic, but the reality of the situation still felt oddly symbolic. There was a soft sound on the other end of the line, as if Emily had stood up from her chair. Give me a moment, she replied gently. I will speak with the doorman and ask him to let you into the lobby at least. I am not trying to keep you outside all night. I nodded instinctively even though she could not see me. Thank you, I answered. The line remained connected but quiet for a few seconds while I heard faint movement in the background of the apartment. I imagined Emily walking across the living room floor toward the window where she could probably see the entrance below. A moment later the lobby door opened and Frank stepped outside with a careful expression. Daniel, your wife just called down, he said politely. She asked me to let you come into the lobby while you two talk. I slipped my phone briefly away from my ear and nodded to him. Thank you, Frank, I appreciate it. He stepped aside and held the door open. As I walked inside, the familiar warmth of the lobby wrapped around me, and the quiet smell of polished wood and fresh cleaning solution greeted me like it had countless times before. Yet tonight everything felt slightly different because I had just experienced what it felt like to stand outside that same door without belonging there. Frank returned to the desk without asking any further questions, which I silently appreciated. I brought the phone back to my ear while standing near the elevators. I am inside the lobby now, I told Emily. There was a small pause before she responded again. Good, she said softly. Claire and I are in the apartment, but I think it would be best if you and I spoke privately first. Hearing that suggestion made sense because the conversation already carried enough weight without adding another person to the room immediately. All right, I replied. What would you like to do? Another brief silence followed before Emily answered. There is a small café 2 blocks away on Maple Street. You remember the one where we sometimes bought coffee on Saturday mornings? I smiled faintly because the place immediately came to mind. The café had large windows and soft yellow lighting that made the inside feel warm even on cold evenings. Yes, I remember it well, I said. She continued speaking with calm determination. If you are willing, I would like to meet you there in about 15 minutes. Claire can stay here while we talk. I want us to have a real conversation without feeling rushed or defensive. I looked toward the elevator doors for a moment and realized that part of me had expected this conversation to happen inside our apartment, surrounded by familiar furniture and quiet routines. But meeting somewhere neutral suddenly felt like the right choice. It removed the invisible walls that had been building between us at home. That sounds fair, I answered after a moment. I will walk over there now. Emily's voice softened slightly before she spoke again. Thank you for being willing to talk, Daniel. I know tonight has not been easy for either of us. I nodded slowly while walking toward the glass entrance again. Relationships are not supposed to be easy all the time, I replied honestly. But they should be worth the effort to understand each other better. As I stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the night air felt a little different than before. The confusion and frustration from earlier had not disappeared completely, but they had been replaced by something quieter and more thoughtful. For the first time since the doorman handed me that envelope, I felt like the evening was finally moving toward an answer rather than a question. I walked the 2 blocks toward the small café on Maple Street with slow, steady steps while the cool night air cleared some of the tension that had been building in my mind since I arrived at the building earlier that evening. The streets were quieter now, and the soft glow from the streetlights stretched across the pavement in long reflections that shimmered slightly from the thin layer of moisture left by the earlier rain. As I approached the corner, I could already see the warm yellow light shining through the wide front windows of the café. The place looked exactly the way I remembered it from our Saturday mornings together. A few people sat inside with coffee cups and laptops while quiet music drifted faintly through the door each time it opened. I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air. The environment immediately felt calmer than the sidewalk outside the building. I chose a small table near the window where I could see the street and sat down while my mind continued replaying the conversation I had just had with Emily. During the next few minutes, I noticed something unusual about the way my thoughts were moving. Instead of defending my actions the way I might have earlier in the evening, I found myself honestly examining the habits that had slowly become normal in my life. The constant work calls. The emails late at night. The promises that we would plan something together later when things were less busy. Each memory now carried a slightly different weight because I was hearing them through Emily's perspective for the first time. About 15 minutes later, the cafe door opened again and Emily stepped inside. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other across the room. She wore the same light gray sweater that I remembered from the morning I left for Denver, and her expression held a mixture of caution and quiet determination. I stood up from the table as she walked toward me. The distance between us was only a few steps, but it felt longer than that because the evening had already changed the way we looked at each other. "Hello, Daniel," she said softly when she reached the table. "Hello, Emily," I replied. We both sat down, and for a moment neither of us spoke because the quiet cafe atmosphere made the situation feel more serious than it might have inside our apartment. Finally, Emily folded her hands together on the table and looked directly at me. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know tonight has been uncomfortable, but I wanted us to have a conversation where we both listen instead of reacting quickly." I nodded slowly because I understood exactly what she meant. The last hour had already forced me to slow down and think in a way I had not done in a long time. "I appreciate that you wanted to talk calmly," I answered. Standing outside the building gave me more time to think than I expected. Emily studied my face for a moment before speaking again. "When I asked the building to deactivate your access, I knew it might seem extreme," she admitted. "But I also knew that if I simply waited for you to return home, we would probably fall back into the same pattern again. We would greet each other politely and the deeper conversation would never happen." I leaned slightly forward in my chair and rested my hands on the table. "I understand that now," I said honestly. "Earlier I felt confused and frustrated, but after thinking about what you told me, I can see why you felt unheard." Emily's expression softened a little when she heard that response. "That is all I needed you to recognize," she said quietly. "I was never trying to punish you, Daniel. I only wanted to know whether our relationship still had room to grow or if we had slowly drifted into a routine where we stopped paying attention to each other." Her words carried a calm seriousness that made the cafe around us seem even quieter. I glanced out the window at the streetlights before looking back at her. "Then let me answer that question clearly," I said. "I do not want our life to become a routine where we only exist beside each other. I want us to feel like partners again." Emily watched me carefully for a moment and then asked the question that seemed to matter most to her. "If that is true, Daniel, then what are you willing to change to make that possible?" I sat quietly for a moment after Emily asked her question because I understood that the answer could not be vague or comfortable if it was going to mean anything. The warm light inside the cafe reflected softly across the table between us, and the low murmur of other conversations blended with the quiet music playing in the background. For the first time that evening, the tension I had felt earlier began to shift into something more focused. Emily had asked what I was willing to change, and I knew that answering honestly required more than simple promises. I leaned forward slightly and met her eyes before speaking. "The first thing I am willing to change is how I treat my time," I said slowly. "For the last year I have allowed my work schedule to expand into every corner of my life without questioning it. I convinced myself that being busy meant being responsible, but I never stopped to ask whether that responsibility was coming at the cost of everything else that matters." Emily listened carefully without interrupting, which made me continue more thoughtfully. "I cannot promise that my job will suddenly become easy or quiet, because that would not be realistic. But I can promise that I will stop pretending that every work request deserves the same priority as the person sitting across from me." Her expression softened slightly, but she remained attentive, as if measuring the sincerity behind my words. I continued speaking because I wanted her to understand that the realization had come from genuine reflection rather than pressure. "When I stood outside the building tonight holding that envelope, I felt something I have not experienced in a long time," I admitted. "I felt what it was like to be separated from the life I assumed would always be waiting for me. That moment forced me to think about how easily routines can replace real connection if nobody stops to question them." Emily rested her hands lightly around her coffee cup and studied me for a few seconds before responding. "I never wanted to compete with your work, Daniel," she said quietly. "I only wanted to know that I was still an important part of your life instead of something that fit into the empty spaces between meetings." I nodded because her sentence captured the problem more clearly than anything else that had been said that night. "You should never have to compete for attention inside your own marriage," I replied. "That realization alone tells me how far I allowed things to drift without noticing." For a moment we both sat quietly while the cafe door opened and closed as other customers came and went. The world outside continued moving as usual, but the conversation at our small table felt like it was quietly resetting something important. After a moment, Emily spoke again in a softer tone. "If we try to rebuild this balance, it will require effort from both of us," she said. "Communication cannot only happen when something goes wrong. I need to feel comfortable speaking honestly before frustration builds up again." I nodded immediately because the truth of that statement felt obvious now. "Then let us start with something simple," I said. "Instead of waiting for another crisis, we make time to talk regularly even when everything feels normal. We can treat those moments as seriously as any meeting or deadline." Emily looked at me carefully, and for the first time that evening a small genuine smile appeared on her face. "That sounds like something worth trying," she replied. The tension that had followed us into the cafe seemed to loosen slightly with that response. I leaned back in my chair and glanced briefly toward the window where the streetlights outside reflected across the wet pavement. Earlier that evening I had arrived home expecting an ordinary night, but instead I had been forced to pause and examine parts of my life that had quietly fallen out of balance. When I looked back at Emily, she was still watching me, but her expression now held a cautious sense of hope rather than distance. After a moment she spoke again. "When we leave here tonight, we can go back to the apartment and talk a little more," she said gently. "Claire will probably pretend she is reading a book, but I know she will be relieved that we actually had this conversation." I smiled faintly at that thought because it sounded exactly like something Claire would do. "Then let us go home after we finish our coffee," I answered. "Not to pretend everything is perfect, but to begin fixing what we almost stopped noticing." Emily nodded slowly and lifted her cup while the quiet cafe around us continued its ordinary rhythm, but for the first time that night I felt certain that the door I had found closed earlier was not the end of something. It was the moment that finally made us open another one together.